Hi, Giles. Thanks for making time. Um,
Hello, good to be with you.
Really nice to have this opportunity to have a chat about the work that you've been involved in. Um, I normally start these conversations with inviting people to tell a little bit about their personal story on how they got into the work they're doing. And so, how did you end up working with Leaders Quest and on regenerative pathways?
Great. Yeah, happy to do that. So I'm in San Francisco, it's where I'm speaking to you from, and I've been a partner at Leaders Quest for 10 or 15 years now. But I grew up in England, and I was indoctrinated as a Marxist before I was indoctrinated as a capitalist, and I'm now ex both of those. So I feel like I've been on kind of a windy path. But I went to Cambridge undergrad, and we had a very left-wing degree course. We had t-shirts that said what's left of Cambridge economics, and it was like a joke because there was nothing to the left of it, and also it was Thatcher and in Britain, and there was nothing left of it in power. And then I went to Stanford Business School, and that was like indoctrination into mid 1980s Friedmanite, the game of business, shareholder value. And I remember there was one guy in our class who was an environmentalist, and we were like, didn't really understand why he was there at business school because it just didn't seem relevant. And I became a management consultant and helped advise big incumbent companies on how to increase market share and increase their stock price. And I just never had a thought about wider responsibilities of business. It wasn't that I decided it was a bad idea. It just wasn't on the radar. And after I'd been a consultant, and I'd also then run a couple of small companies, I went on one of the very first Leaders Quests to South Africa as a friend of Lindsay Levin, the founder. And I guess it was an epiphany. It was a travel adventure somewhere I'd never been before. We went to a sugar mill in Mozambique that was closed down, and there were guys sitting against the wall trying to keep out of the sun, and they were didn't look very happy. And I learned that the sugar mill was closed down because they couldn't export sugar to the EU or the US because of trade restrictions. And not only that, domestic market was messed up because of all the excess sugar coming out of Europe was being dumped in Africa, even though technically they were a low-cost producer. So my business brain was like, these guys should be winning, but because the system is unfair, they're losing. And the investors were losing, and the guys sitting by the wall, the workers, were starving. And I came home with a kind of an anger about how unfair the system was that I'd never experienced before. And I thought it, and I also felt it in my heart and my gut. That's the power of experiential learning. So I kind of changed my view a little bit. It was sort of an epiphany or a transformation, probably didn't happen overnight, but I started to feel a sort of wider sense of what's going on in the world. The market doesn't always give you the perfect answer. And I joined Leaders Quest initially as a sort of friend, and then came on board and became one of the managing partners, and have really loved the work of wrestling in this messy middle of, here's the current system full of imperfection, but it is the system we've got. What are we going to do about it? And that's the work we do at Leaders Quest.
So you do a number of things. On the one hand, you have these quests where you take individuals from different organizations into an experience, and sometimes you also bring in like whole industries, like people from a sector, let's say all in manufacturing or all in the car industry. Is that right?
Yes, it's been a journey for Leaders Quest. It began as bringing individuals like me going to Mozambique, and that was really amazing to have a group of people that didn't know each other going and seeing a place in the world and challenging their preconceptions. Wasn't a very easy business model for Leaders Quest. So it then evolved, and we started doing leadership development programs for companies where we would take 30 vice presidents from some big company to China or whatever, wherever it was, very global. And they had commercial interests in why they were interested in China, but we would then, almost like a Trojan horse, we would broaden the conversation to what is the wider purpose of your company in the world. And it's getting into environmental and social responsibility questions, CSR, ESG kind of things. And we'd ask purpose questions kind of before it was as fashionable as it is now. And then the latest incarnation is, of course, a lot of people working on change programs for companies have realized that even if individual companies are doing good things, it doesn't feel like enough muscle to change the system. And so the idea of sector-wide collaborations has, I think, emerged, and there's more going on there. And Leaders Quest has begun to get involved in some of those as well. And we'd still do all three.
And what kind of the quest bit, what underlines all three of them in the way of working, is to take people out of their normal experience into a kind of almost border experience of like being, I remember one time somebody from your team told me taking CEOs to a high security prison to talk with people on death row or people who are lifelong inmates. And so you hit people with a reality wall that they're don't normally hit in their day-to-day life, and break open their normal structures to the point that they start reflecting more deeply than they would normally. And then you have a very skilled team of facilitators that can hold and build on that process. Is that right?
Yeah, you should write our website, Daniel. That's a terrific explanation. We try to make these encounters be very mutually beneficial and human to human, personal, informal, very hands-on. And we do try to give people experiences and meeting people that they wouldn't normally meet. And then, yes, the facilitation piece is to kind of come away from that conversation or whatever it was and ask very thoughtful, generous, provocative questions about how do you make sense of that? How does it make you see the world differently? To try to tease out insights for people. And certainly if you go to a prison and you meet the leader of a program that's trying to keep the young offenders out of gangs or whatever it is, you can find that very inspirational about a leader in a tough circumstance who's getting amazing results with little resources. And then from that inspiration, you can think, how could I be a better leader in my big car company? We also get powerful results by taking the car company people to, say, Silicon Valley and meeting entrepreneurs. I remember bringing a German car company to Silicon Valley, and we went to a garage startup place, and there was a kind of pitching contest with startups. And they're these young kids with sort of Silicon Valley dreams. And at the end, the car people were saying, gosh, it's pretty tough being an entrepreneur. We know a lot of you will fail, but good luck. It's really great to see you young people. And the young person who was giving the thank you back said, oh, we'll be fine. If it's not this thing, it'll be the next thing. We're great. Good luck to you. And that was like a whoa. And it was like a viral message that went around the whole group of leaders and triggered them in the end to realize they needed to change their culture to become a much more agile company. They made great cars, but they felt slow in comparison to Silicon Valley. So that was an immersion or a learning journey where the big wow was in a business context. So we just look for any context and as many of them as possible. It's like Baskin Robbins ice cream or something where you've 35 flavors or however many it is, or a smorgasbord. Different people will be sparked by different people and meetings and situations. And whatever it is, we're trying to be then ready to kind of help them make sense of it. That's kind of the value.
And how did this deepening of the journey of wanting to not just enable these transformative reflections and processes for companies that would just serve the companies to really being of service to the larger transition that we're now kind of called to do as a species on planet Earth start?
Right.
That there's this, how did Leaders Quest start working on the Future Stewards project and the link with Christiana Figueres and Tom Rivett-Carnac and also with Nigel Topping and the We Mean Business Alliance? Right.
So Leaders Quest was set up as a social enterprise. So it was always in our mission that we wanted to help create a more sustainable, equitable, and inclusive world. I think it says that somewhere. And we've always truly believed it. And I think for a decade or so, we thought that we contributed to that just by working with companies. But we also had to admit that it was frustrating, and they often fall short of what you hope they'll do. And you might have a moving epiphany moment, but to what extent does the company really change how it behaves in the marketplace, given the pressures they perceive them to be under from shareholders, etc.? So we were kind of somewhat satisfied with the impact, but not really satisfied. And it was very natural for us to then try to think of new ways to be of service. And so, yes, we joined up, we created Future Stewards as a kind of side brand, and joined up with the folks you just mentioned. And initially we were working with climate change people, and we let them go on these quest programs to try to kind of help them get new energy and for what was a very long battle. And we did a few years of that, and that then led us to get involved in what became Countdown this year. And the connection with TED, obviously, and putting on this event that was initially going to be in person as a sort of warm-up act before COP26 and went virtual instead. And we spent the last year, a team of us, working with a bunch of collaborators to pull that together. And this is now a year-long process that we'll have another event next autumn, before what we hope will be the live in-person COP26. And so we're I think in a way it's being opportunistic, right? We've got a network of people like Tom and Nigel and Christiana, who and then meeting Ted, and I think it's enabling us to try to find a wider way to have to connect with more people and have a bigger, wider, deeper impact than just the 20 people you take on a quest somewhere.
So how, because like so many other things had to be transformed quite profoundly since the pandemic started. I remember the launch of Countdown and the vision that on the 10th of October there would be this big gathering of about 1,000 change makers on Bergen. In preparation of Glasgow this year rather than next year. So lots has changed this year. But how do you, I've not managed to see all of them, but I've seen the Pope's contribution to that Countdown TED, and I've seen the launch of the what's it called, the new prize that the
Prince William's Earthshot.
Yeah. And do you see that it's just simply taking the message and the dynamic that is going on in so many different areas out there to more people using the platform of TED Global and YouTube to do so? Or is there more strategy to who you invited and building a story with the Countdown project?
I think it's both. Certainly there's a widening of the message using with TED's platform. So instead of just 1,000 people in Scotland, there's hundreds of thousands of people, or hopefully millions over time, who will see these really good videos. There are about 50 of them, and I've seen most of them now, and I have a sort of top 10 favorite list, but there's some really great things, and they're average about 5 minutes long. So there's some superb stuff. Rebecca Henderson from Harvard Business School's 4 minutes about the changes she would like to see to the operating system of capitalism is a very provocative starter for a conversation with anybody, including companies. So there's a broader audience piece, but then also for business leaders, we're very interested at Future Stewards and Leaders Quest in talking to the leaders of today's big businesses. And so a bunch of them were invited. They were on a kind of special platform where they could chat to each other while watching the Countdown videos. And we have an intention they're allowed to have their own TEDx events inside their companies for their all hands employees. So there's a kind of intra-company messaging opportunity you might have a launch of a new product or a sustainability plan or a net zero target, for example. And as a way of kind of announcing that to your stakeholders, you could have a TEDx event with some of these videos, and we would help you facilitate that. And then it will lead up, we hope, to in a year's time, a live event. We don't know what it'll look like yet, but it needs to show progress, right? This is the problem about talking and doing. I think this is creating a lot of energy and good quality material to poke companies to do more, to be braver, to be more ambitious. And this to me is like a dilemma that we all face in this work, is can you really get Walmart and Lego and all these companies, I don't know why I'm naming them particularly, to change enough that the Titanic moves enough in time? And I don't know the answer to that question. I'm not sure anybody really knows. I've always personally felt like I wanted to try. I wanted to be on the team of trying to get the change, the incremental change to happen to the system we've got, as opposed to sort of standing outside the building with a placard and demanding a brand new system from scratch. But I have a good friend of mine was on the board of Greenpeace. She's in my book group, and we have fabulous arguments about this, really, because her perspective is that, I'm doomed to fail. I'm incremental, and the dominant people will do greenwashing and they'll make tiny changes, but it won't be enough. And we're not going to save ourselves unless we way more radical and ambitious than anything I'm talking about.
This is really interesting, because it brings me to a realization that I really only started to have maybe towards the end of last year. Like after having heard myself maybe a bit too often talk about the need for radical transformative change, and that incremental change was no longer good enough. And it's like, and sometimes, you have these catchphrases where you kind of hear yourself think, here I go again. And eventually I sort of suddenly thought, like, actually that's not true, because if I look at where I'm impressed of how much is shifting in terms of the enabling conditions for transformative change to happen, I'm realizing that sometimes incremental change, of course it's not enough, but it is actually shifting ground in a way that transformative change can be so much more agile and so much less traumatic and less breakdown and rebuild. And it's for me, it's like this thing is coming crashing down, and we can find a way that the crash will be a lot milder, and that we've already got the rebuild in place and picking up steam. And I think that's what's now the name of the game to some extent. And that needs everybody on board. And because what I've also, where we connect strongly is through our mutual friend Bill Sharpe and the Three Horizon framework, as a way of helping people frame exactly these different values that all are valuable, but necessarily not commensurable in 1 minute. So you like this whole thing of seeing things as an either or choice rather than a dilemma to navigate, I think really helps to frame what we have to do in this transition space of the second horizon.
I like the way you're kind of you're joining up these two seemingly oppositional ideas, and that maybe if we get to a third of our cars being electric, over the next few years through incremental change. Nigel Topping's a great one for talking about exponential curves, right? One doubles to 2, 2 doubles to 4, 4 doubles to 8, you get to 16, and it starts to get interesting. And there's a lot of history that shows that those sort of things can happen. And maybe what we do in the sort of pushing of change is we try to escalate those curves to make them steeper by getting governments to push, and getting stakeholders to push companies, and BlackRock to do whatever it does on the investor side. And if we can, anything we can do to steepen the curve will get us further, faster. And then if and when a crisis happens, we're in much better shape then, I think. And especially if it's broad. And the thing that makes me somewhat optimistic is I do think that if you look at the 1,000 global big companies, the biggest ones, most of them are on the journey now. They're not necessarily very far along. There's Unilever, which is a poster child, and there's all these stories of things they've done, and we can still be disappointed with them. And then there's loads of other companies that are various places back. Like Lego is sort of trivial example. They want to have all of their plastic blocks be made of biomaterials in a decade. They're 2% of the way there. So great, they've set an ambition, a zero ambition, to kind of reduce their footprint. They've got a lab, they're testing different things, and they're early in it. I think we should applaud that, and maybe they'll hit that target, maybe they'll beat it, maybe they'll fall short. But I think if all of the Fortune 1000 are doing things like that in both the environmental and the social side, and there's a lot of sharing of what's working and what's not working, that's where sector initiatives are valuable, because this stuff can be pre-competitive and collaborative. To a significant degree, I think more than people realize. The beverage industry can all work together to improve packaging and reduce sugar and things like that. There's a lot they can actually do that will work. We'll just get a lot further, and it may prove not to be enough, this incremental stuff, but I'd rather be in that position of being a third done than zero done. Because we'd see these prototypes, right? We'd have these not quite good enough batteries or whatever it is that we'd have available to us. And it's also getting into people's minds. I think there's a huge change happening. It's all around us, this kind of the change in what we understand the point of the economy. And young people are really big drivers of this. And my 1980s Stanford Business School, shareholder value idea is receding in the rearview mirror now. And the idea that the economy actually is in service of the planet, should be in service of the planet. We can reinvent what we mean by GDP. We made it up, right? It's just a concept we made up by Simon Kuznets, 80 years ago or whatever. We can redefine what GDP is, and it can include natural capital and social capital and other kinds of capital. And we can measure that and put that on the news. And companies accounting is being redone as we speak. There are the big four and other bodies are hard at work on how you not just have an ESG report in the footnotes, but how you incorporate some of the externalities into the income statement. Very hard stuff to do.
In that space, I always find, I know that there are really good people working on creating accounting systems that include other forms of capital that isn't just financial capital and other forms of value storage. But what I always find is the dangerous back door of that process, that many people, I would say 99% of the people working on this are not trying to create this back door, but trying to create a solution for humanity. But if we create a system where human to human relationship, human to nature relationship, the value of rivers, the value of it's still within a mindset that has a sort of utilitarian value mindset from an anthropocentric standpoint. It doesn't give the intrinsic value to life of just diversity being of intrinsic value to the health of the planet. And it also opens up the danger of being a form of enclosure, in the sense of enclosure of the commons, that could ultimately lead to even human relationships being in some sort of digitized, AI-guided, multi-capital accounting system that we're then all forced to act in accordance of. And for me, that sounds more like a dystopia than a utopia that I try to create.
I'm looking at that book, Eisenstein, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I read this last year, Climate: A New Story, and he makes that argument, and I was really struck by it. I think you're making a strong point. And if you end up saying that the value of coral is $2 billion because we've calculated it some way and it's going to show up in GDP and companies' income statements and things, it's a very it feels like a slippery slope that we're kind of monetizing everything because the only common measure is the dollar, and some things are almost impossible to put any kind of value on because it's really infinite. So I would say, I guess, that I'm very sympathetic to that being a problem, but I think if we have good awareness of the danger of that as these systems are being designed, which are kind of add-ons to the existing way we account for things and we do transactions and we measure value, we'll have to kind of fix it as we go. I don't think we should not do it. I think it's good to include the cost of the smokestack in the company's costs instead of it being free. But we should be just highly aware of the risk of creating a dystopia where everything has been valued and we're in a value paradigm for things that shouldn't be being valued. And I know you've thought deeply about this, and I think your voice needs to be at that table along with the accountants at Ernst & Young.
But see, I think that because there's this urgency and there's this wonderful, another question where we can go later that maybe is to what extent, because you mentioned Nigel Topping's work, and he was one of the original kind of founders of Future Stewards and bringing in the We Mean Business Alliance, but recently he stepped aside from the We Mean Business Alliance to take this role. I think it's called high-level climate champion of the UK COP process.
Very grand, yeah.
Amazing, yeah. High level is very UN language. They love having everything high level. But he's doing, as far as I understand from knowing a few people that are working with him, he's created this group of climate champions in lots of different sectors, from land use and agriculture to car industry and so on, that are actively engaging sectors in this conversation of how can we unlock the COP process and finally deliver a really stunning result and roadmap of how to implement it at COP26. And in that sense, the pandemic has given another year of preparing that significant new type of COP in a deeper way. So like more power to it, because 25 COPs have not delivered what they're up to do. But I'm still sometimes wondering where, like when you were speaking earlier, I was thinking, yeah, there's all these 1,000 biggest companies, and of course shifting them has a massive impact in the world, and so much more than radically being vegan and having a compost toilet and like, without saying that people who want to do that in any way shouldn't, but in terms of, if you shift one of those monsters, you reduce carbon emissions massively, very, very quickly. And I see that, but at the same time, I'm also wondering, do we need a conversation around really the whole edifices of the capitalist system and the size of the structures that are in it? Like these monstrous organizations like Google or Apple, and I say monstrous simply because of size and economic power. Like they're bigger than many of the world's national economies. And we're creating a set of players that are not under the legal regulations of nation states in the same way. And isn't there possibly, when we do what is now so fashionable to say, like, let's look at nature and learn patterns of health and wholeness and dynamics and resilience from ecosystems and natural systems, then from my 20 years of studying those systems, I would say that we need to ask a question about scale. And that's not the question of how do we scale it up quickly so we do this shift quick enough. But it's how do we refit our human patterns to the scale linking patterns of natural systems, where we understand that anything we say, whether, oh, this is local, this is bioregional, this is national, or this is global, those are models in our mind. The entire thing is one process, and even that goes even beyond the boundaries of Earth, because it's an open system. And so how do we pay attention to the fact that actually so many of those companies you mentioned are possibly too big not to fail, or too big not to have, simply by the virtue of their size and the operation space at the moment, negative impact. So how do we destroy these dinosaurs into phoenixes that come back up, like into many small, locally attuned businesses, rather than one big giant, while not losing the coordination capacity of global collaboration that they also have created. That's the sort of positive side of what some of them have created.
Yes, I think that's another deep topic. I mean, I'm in San Francisco. We're very lucky. We have a view of over the bay, and I see those container ships coming in every day. They're kind of giant and sort of ugly beautiful with all those colored boxes on the roof. And Maersk is one of the brands. You know, Daniel, we make these cards all the time at Leaders Quest. So I've got a stack of cards. One of the cards was about the global shipping business, which is a good example, I think, of an industry where there's a lot of work going on across the whole sector to try to reduce the impacts, because it's quite a big carbon impact, right, from those ships. And so they're doing good stuff, and let's pretend over the next 20 years they'll be successful at getting towards a net zero goal. And that's one of Nigel's 10 sectors, right? I think there's a maritime shipping trade one of the 10. We're helping on some of those as facilitators, because there's a lot of experts, but it's hard work to come together and have a productive team and deliver something at the next COP. So Leaders Quest is helping in a few cases with being the glue in a way for them. So all power to them, but sort of beyond COP26 and beyond their decarbonization goals, that's still a fine tuning of today's global capitalist model. And we are, that's still the growth paradigm and shipping things to America from China, et cetera, et cetera. And it doesn't seem to me I don't see an easy bridge from that paradigm to, for instance, being more bioregional. We could invent a wonderful model of the planet that was based on regionalism, this sort of meso scale idea, which seems quite powerful to me. Very hard to figure out how you would break up the Fortune 1000 companies that are all essentially global, more or less, and how that would work. I mean, I have no clue, really.
No, I mean, me neither. But in terms of understanding the significant patient first, which is the planetary biosphere and life as a planetary process, and how it is structured across scales, and what enables locally attuned but globally interconnected scale linking diversity to keep the system healthy and resilient and adaptable and therefore able to evolve, regenerative. That basically tells me that is the fundamental challenge we have. And it doesn't mean a parochial bioregionalism of people going back into lifeboats and doing their thing in their region, not at all. And there's the danger in making a case for bioregionalism that very quickly you can have the far right ultra kind of localists on the bandwagon coming up with ideas that aren't at all in line with an overpopulated planet in crisis and a humanity that has to come together and join the rest of life in the regenerative enterprise of this century. And so for me, it's just simply a necessity that we need to engage these companies in this conversation of how do we restructure you in such a way that the good bits of global collaboration and knowledge exchange can still be part of what some of them might provide, but you actually become, also in terms of the employment situation that so many countries have, more bioregional economies that are more diverse create a much higher and more diverse labor market and opportunity than these globalized systems that are ultimately using economies of scale and robotic production to basically rationalize humans out of the system. For me, it's also the energy ceiling that we're not fully taking serious in this. That there's still a lot of, like, in this series of conversations, I had the opportunity to talk to Dennis Meadows a few months ago, and he really sort of gave me a bit of a talking to in terms of my idealism of what's still possible. Like he one of the most striking sentences from somebody who co-authored the Limits to Growth report in 1972 was to say, I don't think that the 50 years of work that I've been putting into this have had any effect, and I think I've failed.
Mm.
That's a pretty strong statement from somebody that many of us respect highly for kind of ringing the alarm bell so early on. And my sense is that the future will be bioregional if we want it or not, but we could have a technologically interconnected, wise use of technology of a global cosmopolitan bioregional culture with lots of diverse regenerative cultures, or we could have survival bands of bioregionalists in a kind of dystopian future.
I mean, it seems like we're heading from an apex of globalization into more regionalism. I can see the EU being a sort of self-contained, large enough mega region that much more aggressively pushes a Green New Deal than is likely to happen in the US, for example. And so my guess is for the next 20 years, there's going to be an emergence of mega regions that are more standalone. But I still think that probably Brazil will grow soya beans because they have a lot of water, and they'll ship them in container ships to China because China needs the soya beans. And that's probably going to keep on happening. And it's, if we can make it as efficient as possible, we should. I guess the things that are the big that have the big environmental impacts, like moving things around the planet and using a lot of water, those are all going to get worked on to make them as efficient as possible. The knowledge stuff, I mean, a lot of these big companies that you were just talking about, the other category are not the Maersks and the food companies, but the Googles and Facebooks and Tencents and all those technology companies whose only environmental footprint is their use of energy for data centers, right? Which is a lot. But beyond that, they don't have big environmental impacts. That's not really the issue with them. There's a different kind of issue about globalization going on there. Some quite juicy stuff that's getting very controversial. I tend to think of the two worlds of the physical stuff as one set of problems we're dealing with, and I generally think about bioregions in that sense, I guess. But this other bunch of economic players on the knowledge side and the IT side is a completely different set of issues, because of course the geographic region doesn't even make so much direct sense then. Google is just a search engine, and it doesn't matter what region I'm living in, I can look up and get results.
I mean, they also provide very useful tools for, I mean, Google Earth is a fantastic tool for starting ecosystems restoration in the fine grain, and there are now lots of kind of enhanced versions coming out, like plugins that operate on Google Earth and that data, but actually provide really detailed ecological restoration data for regions.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we're really starting to at least get to grips with this idea of we've cut down half of the world's forests and we need to reverse that. And we've depleted most of the world's soils and we need to reverse that. And with the UN Decade for Ecosystems Restoration coming up, there seems to be a lot of positive commitment in the right direction. But it's, for me, it's this, I'd love to hear your experience of how influential this Three Horizons framework that allows the visionary, more systemic transformations to also stay in the room when we're having the more kind of strategic conversations of what's a technical possible and what can we do tomorrow, and what can like the kind of more roadmappy, step-by-step, incremental change conversation, rather than the how do we do that and keep the need to rewrite the rules of the playing field and to restructure scale and collaboration in a different way. Also,
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of the Three Horizons concept. I think Bill Sharpe's giving us a great gift, and the other collaborators with it. Earlier this year, we've been working at Leaders Quest with one of the big food and drink companies who've got, you know, a classic portfolio of things that are not necessarily all that healthy, and it's frustrating for them because they occasionally try and launch a low sodium food or a low sugar drink, and the consumers don't buy it because they like it to be sweet and salty and cheap. So they're often quite frustrated that they feel like they're compelled to produce this not that healthy stuff. But we use Three Horizons. You know, the first horizon is today's paradigm that's keeping the lights on, and we need that. The third horizon is the visionary new paradigm of sort of fantasy, but it's coming. And then the really interesting second horizon of experiments, the entrepreneurial mindset, and how the world needs and a company needs to honor those three perspectives. You can be a company and you can recognize that you are a member of the first horizon, but you know the world's changing. And if you want to be relevant in 20 or 50 years' time, you need to be thoughtful about the third horizon vision of where we might be going and the second horizon bridge. And we found this has been it's worked well in companies because the most successful companies do have all three horizons as respected parts, and they're not over dominated by one voice. If the first horizon is completely in control, the people in the R&D lab are not respected, and it's unlikely that their projects will get traction. They'll be dismissed as fanciful. That company is then not going to be the company that introduces the next generation of products. And I think you can appeal to companies wanting to stay relevant. This food and drink company was looking to come up with an ambitious 10 to 20 year system change for a very troubled industry with the problems you're mentioning about soil and water and you know, they know what the problems are, and they know they're part of monocropping, and they want to find a way to where they're like, where can we play and where can we be successful because we bring our skills and strength and reputation, where can we bring that to bear? And so they were literally on a kind of search process of let's name some ideas and some areas, and then let's try some things, let's experiment. General Mills, which is a different company than the one I'm alluding to, they have the 1,000,000 acres, right, which is being farmed regeneratively. And they're providing training and education assistance to those farmers. And it's an experiment to see if regeneratively farmed crops to go into Cheerios and things like that, can that type of farming have competitive yields to the industrial farming? And they hope the answer is yes, that it can be competitive, and then that they can expand from the 1,000,000 acres, which sounds like a big number, but it's a tiny number really. And then it would grow, and then other companies would copy.
Yeah, but of course, I mean that's again where the difficulty lies of the current playing field rules define what is competitive, and competitive means over harvesting to a point that you're living off capital rather than interest.
Yeah.
And so you're degrading the system year by year, topsoil and so on and so forth. And so how do you factor in long-term rebuilding of the soil, carbon drawdown in biomass in the soil, and all those kind of aspects? But in terms of that dilemma, that these big companies are actually realizing the writings on the wall and do want to change, and they're also run by people who have sons and daughters who are now part of Fridays for Future or Extinction Rebellion, telling them,
you bet,
you're really messing things up, and I don't want to speak to you anymore. And who do you think you are, messing with my future? Yeah? And that there's many people who've had their epiphanies in these companies to realize, wait a minute, what am I actually doing? And I mean, you've been running through Leaders Quest and Future Stewards this process that Porticus funded around inquiry into what is a regenerative economy, and one of the outputs is this new website that is called Regenerative Pathways, and as far as I understand, it is the first iteration of something that is going to keep growing, evolving, deepening, and so on. But it's aimed to be a place where companies that say, give me some inspiration, let me see what the others are doing, where do I start this conversation, where do I start this journey, could go and find the first kind of indications of what they might want to inquire into. Is that right? Or what was the aim of the website?
Yes. Porticus Foundation, the funding for them comes from some big family businesses that do take this view that they want to be regenerative, but they're private businesses, and their question to us was, how do we get this way of thinking into regular mainstream public companies? Because otherwise it could just be hot air. It sounds nice, let's be regenerative, who could be against that? But what's going to make them really do it? And the messaging is quite hard, because you end up like lecturing people or nagging them or protesting outside their building, but there's not anything for them to grab onto. So we tried to aim towards, it's a website as a portal. We're trying to gather deep, cutting edge stuff with practical examples of what it means, with examples of companies doing things, and really being honest about what's working and what's not working. And it's a struggle. Nobody's got it all right, but people are trying things and they're learning things, and presenting that in a kind of non-boring way. And so we're trying to be quite experimental and playful, actually, with how we communicate it. So we might end up having a cartoon, for instance, where a fictional big company is trying to be or some people in it are trying to be regenerative, but some of the brand managers or whatever are shooting them down. And it would be kind of amusing. It would be like an episode of Seinfeld or something, but it would be a cartoon that would engage people. We're interviewing executives and saying, what's your epiphany moment? Tell us that story. When did you take the red pill from the Matrix? We've got diagrams that we think kind of capture a lot, like the donut from Kate Rayworth. And then we talk about how to think about them. So we're trying to provide a sort of easy access website with genuinely good quality content that is non-boring. I keep using this phrase, non-boring, because people glaze over. Everyone's busy and in a hurry. Nobody wants to read yet another long, boring article about how you should do this and that and the other. And I think people will be motivated in business by success case studies. And so Rebecca Henderson at Harvard tells about Lipton tea improving the sustainability and regenerativeness of the tea plantations, and how that all worked, what it cost, what was hard about it, what impact it's had on the soil, and how Unilever, as the parent company, got paid. Why was it sensible for them? What was the business case for that? And they couldn't raise prices of tea because it's a competitive business against the other tea companies. It's a semi-commodity. What they did do was they gained some market share because they got to do advertising about how Lipton was a much more purposeful brand. And in Australia and France and a few other countries where they pushed this line of advertising and repositioned the brand in that way, more people in the supermarket chose it, and they gained a couple of points of market share, which they then justified inside Unilever as, look, we were ahead on the game. We spent these hundreds of millions upstream at the tea plantations, and it made us money. We gained this. We're a bigger business as a result. And I think in general, Unilever says its purpose brands, there's 20 or 30 of them now, are outperforming its non-purpose brands. And so Unilever has convinced itself that there is a powerful business case within today's measurement system of capitalism that means it's right to do this kind of thing. Brilliant, right? I'm delighted to hear that. Whatever story you need to prove that it works in the field and in the financial markets, do more of that. So some other company will see that Unilever story and think, maybe with a little help from a consultant or whatever, but they'll think, what's my version of that story? Because I don't want to be left behind. I need a purpose brand too. That's my hope, how this kind of incremental work with today's first horizon companies can actually get us out of jail, and that it will escalate. And it will seem small potatoes right now, but the potatoes grow. And pretty soon you have a lot of potatoes. I like potatoes.
I mean, I think it certainly will buy us time, and it certainly will make it easier to do more fundamental transformations. I still think that there is a need for a deeper rethinking of.
I agree. I agree. I think buying time is what we're doing. I totally agree, Daniel. And it's these things, just making the tea a little bit better is not ultimately the paradigm shift that the world's going to need. It's buying us time, and maybe these experiments are giving us insights as to what the detail of that paradigm shift needs to actually involve.
For me, it's one of the things where people could dismiss the whole bioregional approach as being, well, yeah, as you were saying, how do you get from where we are now to that system? Difficult enough. But what I believe is it's actually aligning with the developmental evolutionary process of life as a planetary process, transforming ecosystems so they create conditions conducive to life. And we need to re-inhabit those ecosystems, come back home to them in a different way. And what the bioregional focus will allow us to have conversations around is networks of relationships and webworks of local synergies that we can only experience once we really focus on becoming part of a place again, expressions of that place, true manifestations of life's regenerative impulse as another species in that place. And that will ultimately, to my mind, create cultures that won't be so stuff focused, so things focused, products that you buy off a shelf from a big company, but it'll be much more qualitative. This notion of, I can't remember how George Monbiot was framing it, but social luxuries and private constraint, in the sense of some of the real luxury goods at the regional scale we enable each other to have by not having one each, and finding much more agile ways of sharing things that otherwise are just lying dead. Like the classic example of the average power drill in a European household is used 3 minutes a year, but everybody has a power drill at home. But yeah, so I'm wondering, how do you see this Regenerative Pathways platform evolve? Like one of your teammates has asked me to suggest some like a new category of pathfinders or wayfinders, like pioneers, people that have basically, like, long before I started talking about regenerative, have been pioneering regenerative practice for decades. So they're going to be end up showcased on that site as well, hopefully.
Yep.
What else do you see evolving there?
Yeah, I am, and we Leaders Quest are kind of Johnny-come-latelys to regenerative. It's obviously not a new idea. People have been pioneering this for some generations. And so I think for it to be a useful portal, it needs wide input and authorship from experts, so that it can be broad. This goes back to, I guess, one of Leaders Quest's sort of core concepts, which, when I was talking about taking people on those learning journeys, that if you have a wide array of possible types of material, different people will be sparked by different ones. So I'd like it to be as broad as possible. I'd also like, this is post-COVID, I think, but I'd love to take people on quests again, all about place, like you were just saying, the sort of the uniqueness of place, and getting business people to sort of have that as a starting point, not as a sort of side effect. And then, I happen to like beer. My ancestor invented IPA, India Pale Ale, so sort of a beer family. But, beer was very boring when I was growing up. There was just these mass brands. And now we've had this explosion of craft beer, which is very regional and local. And I think a lot of people have come to realize it's a lot better. It's tastier and it's different, and there's lots of variety. It's almost become crazy with sort of fruit flavored beers and things. But I think consumers can be much happier with local and regional products than big generic ones, and that will apply across lots of categories. And that gives me a sense of optimism about the potential for localness and regionalness to be thriving ideas. They don't have to be premium hipster products at all.
And I think it's actually, if we took that turn towards a bioregional restructuring that is globally interconnected and collaborative, that's always really important to say. Like, it has to be cosmopolitan in view. Like, the only, like, what I learned from Bill Reed from Regenerative Institute in a conversation a couple of years ago, he said this very obvious sentence, but it really landed in me, that you can't save the planet, you can only save places. Like, it's just too big of a scale to try, let's change planetary health. But if we heal place by place, ecosystem by ecosystem, bioregion by bioregion, if we build soils, replant the forests, heal the waterways, then we're contributing, because place is always fractal. Each place is also part of the planet. So ultimately you are healing the planet if you heal the place. And in that process, I think we're going to find and this is part of the bigger restructuring, I think, of getting out of those silos of business, like sort of the private sector, the public sector, and the civil society sector, and realizing that we're all human beings, and each one of them is just playing roles in these sectors, and that when we work at the bioregional scale, they can actually be much more pliable and meldable. They're not quite so distinct. And in a similar way, I think that people being consumers, like, there's such opportunity in being part of cooperatives and like with neighborhood ownership models, carpools, all those kind of things. People will begin to, just as people are now, like, even employers are now getting more comfortable with teleworking because of the pandemic. People will, as they start doing it, they will become a lot more comfortable with co-owning with other people, with suddenly realizing that it actually relieves them of a responsibility of owning an expensive piece of equipment, because if they co-own it with a lot of people, if it needs fixing, there'll be somebody fixing it, and they'll be there the next day, and the cost will be a 20th of a 100th of what they would have had to pay if they owned it themselves. And right. I think so it's similarly, people will become prosumers in many ways. Like the roof space of their house will be rented to somebody creating solar electricity, and they might not be doing it themselves, but it might be done at the neighborhood or by regional scale through companies. And so I think that's where we need to weave across business fields, sectors, and these categories, and build. Ultimately, it's about relationship building to people and place, because like as we reconnect to our communities and our local culture and our local uniqueness of place, there's just so much more meaning coming back than any money could buy. And that's where I'm putting a lot of my hopes.
Yes, I like that. There's a lot more meaning than money could buy. I think when we were doing shareholder capitalism, for me back at business school was very simple, right? It was business was in its little box optimizing. And this idea of blurring the boundaries and being business and government and citizens and all the different stakeholders, this stakeholder capitalism thing is a manifestation of the trend you're talking about. It's much more complicated. Suddenly we're having to trade off different stakeholders wanting different things. So the job of the business person's optimization challenge has suddenly got much more complicated. But that's okay. We can cope with that. We do that every day as citizens. We're constantly not optimizing, but just satisficing. And we can be very happy with that. So I think this widening of the thing that's going with ESG, which is having its kind of day in the sun at the moment, and it's somewhat controversial, I guess, for some people, but I think that's part of a mega trend of business bleeding into life and these edges becoming blurry, and I'm all in favor of that. I think we can sort of relish the complexity, and maybe in the long run, the Big Mac was a symbol of globalism, right? It's been used that way. It is slightly different. If you eat a Big Mac in Paris, it tastes a little bit different than one in New York. And why not? Why not have Big Macs taste different all around the world? And why not? Why isn't that a great thing? And then I would have thought McDonald's could make some advertising out of that. I think often these things things can be turned into opportunities for everybody, and life can end up with a lot more richness and meaning. That to me is just better, right? Not that I would probably choose a Big Mac if I took a visit to Paris, but the fact that it would be different than the one I'd had back home would be awesome.
Yeah, but the footprint of the meat industry, unless it's like very small scale regenerative farming, or like, I mean,
it probably should be meatless. I know, yeah.
Meatless, or a very different type of meat. But yeah, we could go down that road. I mean, that is the dilemma that we need to navigate. That there's a sort of perfect state that is a lot further away from all those transformations of the large businesses than that we're talking about. But at the same time, those transformations are the beginning of a conversation that value the individuals in those companies as being part of the solution and contributors to a transformation. And of course, the danger is always, if we maintain those large superstructures for too long, are we part of some sort of predatory delay that even well intended, we're enabling them to be the key players for that much longer, that by the time the transformation is really starting to take root, we've wasted 10, 15, 20 years that would have actually been the critical time. And I very often find that is a dilemma that is difficult to find an answer to. But
yeah, it is, isn't it? I think predatory makes it sound evil, and it's kind of benign predatory delay.
yeah.
Like the company that's selling you the drill that you don't really need to buy because you could borrow your friend's drill, they're not necessarily being evil. They're just part of the game. Yeah. But I guess what it means is that the sharing of the drill, that sharing economy, which we're using as an example, I guess, here of an alternative system, that just needs to be very easy and fun and friendly, and you have to sense the benefits. Like, you start to know your neighbors more because you're running in and out of their houses, borrowing their equipment. And if people can feel that the new thing is inherently better than the old thing because they didn't have to buy a drill and they made a friend, and they can be an expert I'm the drill expert and you're the roof expert, and we benefit from each other and our sense of community is improved, that system should win. And nature would tell us that system will grow at the expense of the previous system. It just has to be better.
And I think that's what I'm increasingly realizing, is that the realm of narrative and of meaning making and of story weaving is actually critical in all of this. It's the cultural change that will get people to really then begin to come together with others, and like as I say ad nauseam in my book, start living the questions together. How can we do this differently? What can we do to make a difference in making this place more regenerative? And it's building the capacity amongst people in place to keep adapting to these new circumstances, and in the process contribute to the healing of their communities and their places, that ultimately, to my mind, regeneration is all about. And
Yeah. Yeah.
and to
We
enable
do have to tell stories, and these experiments in the second horizon, they don't all work, and it's totally okay that there are failures. I joined a car sharing program a few years ago because we weren't using our car very much, and we put it on the system, and people would borrow it and bring it back, and it worked beautifully, and I got a little bit of money for it. And then one day somebody crashed it, and then it got paid for. The repair was paid for by the system, but I didn't have my car for 2 months because it took a long time. And then I didn't feel so good about the whole thing afterwards. It started, and then somebody else smoked some drugs in the car, and we couldn't get the smell out of the carpet. And so I had very mixed feelings about this car sharing thing with my car. But that's okay, right? The point of the second horizon is test and learn. Lots of experiments. Some things work. You build the ones that work. You change the ones that don't work. And it doesn't mean the whole thing was terrible and you shouldn't have done it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, that's why I applaud also all these efforts at large scale systems change with big companies or with big industries that like Future Stewards and their ecosystems are engaged in, because they're just as important as these experiments at the small scale where people really try to create new ways of living and commit their lives to restoring 150 hectares of rainforest. We need both.
Yeah, and we have to have empathy for how scary change is. I think about, and we've just had this election in America, and that we have this big conservatives liberal divide that is such a shame that we have it. But I do feel that there's something about conservatism, small c, of love and respect and confidence in how things were for us in the past. And we can both acknowledge that we cannot go on like this because we're crashing the planet and radical change is needed. And at the same time, I think we can really lean into respecting the things that were good about the past, especially values things and way of life things, and that we're not just chucking everything out instantly and the future world is going to be completely like a science fiction fantasy, because that really freaks people out, and then you lose the political battles.
Absolutely.
And I think people who are sort of progressives about changing the planet for very good reason, crisis type reason, need to get a lot better at the storytelling to help calm people down who are justifiably and genuinely afraid about the destruction of things that they hold dear.
And yeah, the awareness that the current first horizon was the previous third horizon, and also possibly the awareness that when we turn towards science and technological magic, we dismissed some ways of being and some ways of connecting with place and life that indigenous people have held for millennia as primitive knowledge, instead of understanding that was actually our species' collective inheritance. And I think if we go back and heal that wound of having actually thrown out the baby with the bathwater, and that we need to reintegrate some of the core understandings of how to be in alignment with life's patterns and life as a planetary process, which indigenous people always knew, that will then also naturally make us ask the question, and what is it that we shouldn't throw out this time when we transform the current capitalist system? Like rather than making it a pendulum swing, getting completely away from the old system and everything it did just do the exact opposite, which is what we tend to frame our paradigm shifts under.
Yeah.
To say no, let's be a bit more nuanced than that, and say what is the red line of the first horizon on the other end of the horizon, 3 horizon map? What do we want to keep? And I think that's vital. But yeah, we've had a long conversation, and we could probably keep going, but this has been really wonderful. And
I've enjoyed it. Yeah, I feel like we covered some ground, and it was fun. And it's now time for you to have an evening beverage and for me to have lunch.
okay.
Thank you very much for the